We're grateful to have you all here this morning. We can feel the enthusiasm as you have awoken and are joining us this morning. We recognize that there are people coming from all over the world with different time zones. We hope that this will catch us all awake early in the morning and that you'll be able to adjust quickly. My name is Bob Smith. I'm the Managing Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. I'll be the moderator today, and we're joined by a wonderful panel. As we, before introducing our distinguished guests, I want to just indicate quickly that as a matter of protocol for our symposium, we will strive diligently to begin and end on time, and we want to make sure that everyone has a headset. It's imperative that everyone have a headset because we will be having questions and answers from the audience, and it's important that everyone have that. Let's see, we need some headsets. You can stay here. We need headsets for some of our panelists, and if you don't have a headset, just raise your hand, and we'll have the students bring you down a headset shortly. Okay. If you'll take note of those without headsets and please hold your hands up high. Okay. We've got several that need headsets. We'll all need headsets. Secondly, we want to make sure that the translation is coming through. Is anyone's language not being translated? Is everyone getting the translation? Okay. If someone is not getting translation, raise your hand. Okay, what language? Arabic. Okay. To our translators, can someone come in the door and signal me that we can get Arabic up and going? Let's see. Is Arabic coming through? Let's, Sean Boshoff, before you take your seat, would you mind going over to the translator booth and ask them how Arabic is doing? Okay. We will work on that. Are there any other languages that are not being translated? Okay. We will work on that. My apologies for the delay. Let me just indicate that we have, as we've mentioned, we've had this symposium for 22 years, and the most consistent.
There's no Arabic today. They're coming tomorrow. Oh, this is very bad. Should I ask them to arrange it?
Yes, I know what's going on. Okay. The most consistent feedback that we've received is the strong desire for question and answer time. And so this session, this opening plenary session, has been established with that in mind. So we have time for questions and answers. So please take note as you hear from our speakers today. We are very grateful to have three distinguished panelists. Marco Ventura, who's a professor from the University of Siena, Italy, who's also spent a great deal of time studying and teaching in Europe, in other parts of Europe as well. Faizan Mustafa, Vice-Chancellor from NALSAR University of Law in India, and Tim Wilson, the Australian Human Rights Commissioner. Now, their biographies are listed in your program, and as a matter of protocol for our symposium, we will attempt to not go through each of the biographies. We've spent a great deal of time and effort, as you have, putting together the nice printed version of people's biographies. And so we hope that you'll take the time to review their eminent qualifications, their experience, and all that they bring to us today. As we begin today's session, it is on the topic of religious freedom and social stability. Both topics cry out for some definition as to what those two terms mean. They are laden with all sorts of different meanings and understandings throughout the world. And I hope that throughout today's session, not only will we learn the specifics of some of the ideas that our panelists have prepared, but that I'll encourage them to take some time thinking about how they would define and bring their thoughts in the context of a definition of religious freedom and social stability. For example, I looked up this morning a popular definition of social stability, and it said this: social stability is a sociological perspective that states that a group always seeks to maintain equilibrium by forcing out ideas and individuals that disagree with popular opinion. Now, I would hope that many of us would find issue with that definition of social stability, that our task is not to force out contrary ideas, but to have something more akin to the ideals that John Locke taught many years ago now, but was one of the foundations of modern thought, that pluralism and the protection of different ideas is what brings social stability. So we may have a discussion about how social stability works. Last night we were treated by wonderful presentations that began to illuminate these ideas, and I was taken by Professor Little's thoughts about World War II and the Nazi regime and some of the atrocities that were perpetuated. But I was thinking about the notion of peace and how it plays into social stability. And I couldn't help but be reminded of some of the early discussions. You are probably aware of the Prime Minister of England who sought peace with honor, and Winston Churchill famously said that his agreements with the Nazi regime would bring neither. They would not have honor, nor would they ultimately have peace. And so sometimes social stability may not mean immediate peace. And so we have to be reconciled to an interesting and nuanced view of what social stability really means, as we also seek to fulfill our lives, to live out our conscience, and to protect the rights of others against the majority in some cases, and other situations where minorities seek to do things that are dangerous or hurtful. So we have to think about what it really means to have social stability. Let me just indicate then that we will begin and allow each of our panelists 20 minutes to make their presentations. We will go in the order listed in the program, and this will be also a model for our panels because it helps our translators know what's coming next. So we will begin with Marco Ventura, then Faizan Mustafa, then Tim Wilson, who will each go for no more than 20 minutes, and then we'll stand, rest our legs, and then begin with questions and answers. So let's begin with Marco Ventura.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, let me start from stating my gratitude for this opportunity, for being with you today. Very grateful and honored to share a few thoughts of mine with you. And as an expert in law and religion, this is a very special place for me, for all of us, for the community of experts in law and religion. This has grown as a place where people passionate for law and religion, people involved in advocacy in the field of law and religion or in research feel at home. And this is, again, a very, very special occasion for me as one belonging to this community. As you can see from the subtitle for my presentation today, I will argue that when we think of the articulation of religious freedom and social stability, human agency should be recognized a very key place. I will develop this idea in three parts. So I will share with you three basic thoughts. The first one is that the post-colonial global world redefines the interaction of law and religion. This is a very fundamental reality with which we are all confronted. Redefinition of each of the two terms, of law on the one hand, of religion on the other, a redefinition of their interaction. Then my second step will be looking at religious freedom and social stability as a result of this transformation as in jeopardy. And I will have a few thoughts on this sense that religious freedom and social stabilities are threatened. And then the third step will be, as I mentioned already from the subtitle, my argument that human agency is key to an appropriate articulation of religious freedom and social stability. Now, let me start from this quote on the bottom of this slide, which encapsulates what I mean by the fact that we are confronted with a fundamental transformation of the reality of religion and the law, as well as of our perception of this reality. Just before coming to Provo, I read on an Oxford University Press blog this decalogue, these 10 facts about Buddhism, authored by a renowned scholar in the field of Buddhist studies, Damien Kean. Now look at fact number 1. So the first fact to know about Buddhism, according to this scholar. I quote, the term Buddhism was coined by Western scholars in the 1830s. Buddhists don't actually refer to their religion as Buddhism. I will not discuss whether this is correct, adequate, appropriate, shared or not. I'm just interested in pointing at the very fact that we are confronted today with a fundamental transformation and inherent challenge in how we perceive and understand what religion is, with a very special reference to the post-colonial dispensation, which is very, very clearly stated here. There is a sort of Western invention of religion, which is now challenged in the name of a post-colonial, post-Western, or no longer Western-centered narrative. Now, let's come to my first point more specifically. I will offer a couple of examples of what I mean more exactly by this assertion that the post-colonial global world redefines the interaction of law and religion. The first example is the proclamation by the United Nations General Assembly of an International Day of Yoga, which was in fact celebrated for the first time this year. The second example will be the European Union guidelines for the protection and promotion of freedom of religion or belief. In which sense the United Nations International Day of Yoga is evidence of this very general transformation. A lot could be said. Let me just articulate and present a few items of a few aspects of this transformation that we can observe through this United Nations endorsement of yoga. Well, the first element is that global religion mixes up Western and non-Western elements. Some might say this widespread global celebration of yoga as an advancement of non-Western religion, as evidence that the global religion is de-Westernized, is less Western. Some others could rather argue that to some extent what is at work is a sort of Western appropriation of yoga. But of course, these Western and non-Western elements are inextricably connected, and we are condemned to some extent to observe both at the same time. So those who be concerned with some protection of some Western religious identity will be worried of yoga invading from the East their space, and maybe some tenets of some pure or essential Eastern understanding of yoga would be concerned with the West appropriating yoga by forms of practice and even merchandising in the West. Now, second observation about what is changing and what we can deduce from the widespread reorganization of yoga is that organized global religion is less church-shaped. Of course, there will be some people who probably rightly argue that yoga is, like many non-Western religions' expression, to some extent churchified. There is an interesting scholarship in this regard about Hinduism being syndicalized or transformed into a sort of church for the sake of Hinduist nationalist politics. But it is in general possible to observe that the very organization of religion in the shape of a church is to some extent widely challenged today. And this is always another fact to which the International Day of Yoga can point at. As I mentioned before, patterns of global religious marketing and consumerism are strengthened today as a result of the advancement of global forms of religiosity. And this is, again, another element of what we observe as a new religious phenomenon, and not just religious. This is also an element of transformations on the legal side. Because insofar as religion is understood, sometimes promoted and organized according to a market-based model, this will affect also the regulation, the legal regulation of religion. A lot of religious minorities in Europe took advantage from market regulations, the regulations of the single market in Europe, to protect their activities in a much more efficient way than they could achieve through a classical religious freedom-based approach. One further element, states endorse religious practices in the name of the cultural value. A very trivial quote here from the debate on President Narendra Modi's understanding of yoga as a national product, of which Indians should be proud of, especially as they export yoga all over the world. But what are we talking about here? Are we talking about religion? Are we talking about something which is not religious, which is cultural? We are all familiar with this debate about the boundaries of the religious. And finally, states struggle with drawing the line between the religious and the non-religious. Americans are familiar with the debates in the US about whether yoga should be understood as a religious practice or not, and President Obama, in fact, endorsed a different view for the sake of a yoga practice to some extent, but this endorsement was met with strong criticism for those who would be very uncomfortable with defining yoga as a non-religious for the sake of the protection of the non-establishment clause. So these are just examples of what we can deduce from one single item, from one single event, in terms of the transformation of the religious and of the legal. A second example from the guidelines for the protection and promotion of freedom of religion or belief, which has been adopted in 2013 by the Council of the European Union. This example points, first of all, of at the rise of this category of freedom of religion or belief, religion and belief, which is, of course, not new, not recent, but has been increasingly presented in the recent times as the key formula, which tends to be preferred to a more traditional expression, religious freedom. For many reasons. We heard yesterday about religious freedom protecting, according to United Nations, according to the European Convention for Human Rights, theistic, atheistic beliefs. It is for sure that there are also social transformations behind this preference for religion or belief. And these transformations concern, especially in the West, the fact that an increasing a number of people define themselves as non-affiliated to any religious organizations or not belonging to any religion. Now, this document of the European Union is also evidence that supranational organizations increasingly concur and compete with states in the regulation of religion, which is yet another strong element of this transformation of the interaction of law and religion. Also, global freedom of religion or belief mobilizes states and non-state actors. So state and non-state actors tend to understand their advocacy in the area of religious freedom more and more in global terms, in international terms, which again affects the very concept and organization of religion and the law. Finally, this is a document which is not a binding document. These are just the guidelines. And I take this as an example of the rising importance of soft law in the area of law and religion. So we have transformations on all sides, including for lawyers here on the very legal structure of how religion is approached. Let me move now to my second part, which is the fact that as a result of these deep transformations in the concept and perception and the reality of religion and the law respectively, and of the interaction of law and religion, we have a feeling that religious freedom and social stability are in jeopardy. I will offer a few reflections on the articulation of religious freedom and social stability, and I will then point at what I define as wrong approaches. So let me look at 4 possible articulations of religious freedom and social stability. First of all, it is not that uncommon that religious freedom is seen as a threat to social stability. Insofar as governments and sectors of the public opinion, social actors, civil society, perceive social stability as based on a given religious landscape in the relevant area, region or country, religious freedom can be perceived as a threat insofar as through religious freedom, that religious landscape is likely to be altered. And we are all aware of this possible understanding of religious freedom. However we understand that national or cultural or religious landscape. It could be a multi-religious landscape threatened by new forms of religiosity who are not inclined to endorse some national ethos that religions in place have accepted. or it can be a region or a country with a very, very strong religious majority, which is threatened by minorities through religious freedom. Second possible articulation, social stability, is a threat to religious freedom. What I mean by that is that, again, it is possible to think of patterns of conservation of a given social balance, of a given social equilibrium, as a threat to a real social and legal religious freedom. A third pattern, religious freedom can be seen as indispensable to social stability, insofar as we understand the social stability as truly involving a real competition of religions. And the fourth element, social stability, is indispensable to religious freedom. Now, we can have, when we think of this articulation of religious freedom and social stability, we can have, I believe, two wrong approaches. The first is that we understand religious freedom and social stability in a light way, or too light a way. What I mean by that is that we feel some need to agree, because we feel that an agreement is much needed, especially in the international conversation, international community, about the fact that we all stand for these principles. And we are ready to pay a price to this agreement in terms of what exactly we mean by religious freedom and by social stability. Hence, this sense that we agree on something precisely because that something has no specific meaning, because that something is an empty shell. Second wrong approach, too heavy a concept of both religious freedom and social stability. I stand for my religious freedom. And by my, I mean religious freedom which is shaped in a way that is beneficial to me, which is tailored on my project, on my strategy, on my needs. But it can also mean my in the sense of my conceptual understanding of what religious freedom is. We are all aware, this was mentioned yesterday already, of this very basic alternative between cultural religion, based on to which I belong because I belong to a nation, because I belong to a culture, versus sort of choice-based religion, the religion of my individual choice, sort of collective and individual. Well, this is what is at stake here, I believe. Now, what I mean by my proposal, let's say, of human agency as a key to an appropriate articulation of religious freedom and social stability, let me first give you an example of what I understand by human agency in the context of our conversation, and then I will say a few final words on how human agency can be applied to religious freedom and social stability. I will use a quote from a report on violence committed in the name of religion, which was issued in December 2014 by Professor Heiner Bielefeld, UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. Quote, human agency is inevitably involved in interpreting religious traditions, dogmas, laws, or identities. Open-minded interpretations that encourage tolerance, empathy, and solidarity across boundaries may exist alongside narrow-minded interpretations of the same religion, which lead to polarized worldviews and a militant rejection of people holding other persuasions. Whatever the ultimate origins of a religious belief are thought to be, human beings bear in any case responsibility for the practical consequences that they draw from the interpretation of their faith. Well, this applies to a very specific phenomenon, violence in the name of religion. But I believe, as I was preparing this presentation, that to some extent the very same reflection can be applied to our field. And in particular, I argue that it is very important when we think of how to combine religious freedom and social stability, to mine for practical consequences. I'm borrowing this expression from the text before. Mining for practical consequences of religious freedom and social stability, that it is essential to sensibly interpret sources, religious and otherwise. So it is possible to, I believe, apply the reflection which addresses religious leaders and the interpretation of religious sources, probably to other kinds of sources, including legal sources or political sources. It's the same kind of endeavor, I believe. And finally, responsibly exercising leadership, religious and otherwise. So this was my reflection that I wishes to share. I'm looking forward to the exchange in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
If you don't mind, you could turn the lights back up in the back there. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely grateful to Professor Cole Durham and other friends at BYU for giving me this opportunity to share my reflections on religion, law, and social stability from the India's perspective. I come from a country which had many, many religions. In 6th century BC, as many as 600 religions originated in India. We have only 2 of them surviving, and a reference was made to one of them by my predecessor, to Buddhism. For many years, as many as 25 years or so, as a student of constitutional law and freedom of religion, I took great pride in India's plurality, in India's management of heterogeneity and diversity. I took great pride in the tolerance jurisprudence of India. Then I went for a conference in China. And as soon as I got into my taxi, the taxi driver asked me, "How come you have such a small number of Buddhists in India?" And I was ashamed that we have Buddhist majorities elsewhere, but not in India. And that is a kind of dilemma in which I am today. Constitutionally speaking, my country presents one of the best documents on religious freedoms. Most governments in India so far have been committed to religious freedom. We had aberrations here and there. And I am confident that the country's majority community, which is hugely tolerant, which has been the great advocate of minority rights and religious freedom, would take care of its minorities. Yet, these aberrations are disturbing. At the moment, I think of a latest tweet which somebody has done about someone killed in India just 3-4 days ago for alleged consumption of beef. Now, no law prohibits in India consumption of beef. There are, of course, laws which prohibit slaughter of cow. Yet, there was this madness, and this madness happened some 35 miles from the residence of the Prime Minister in Delhi. And the interesting tweet was, and I quote, "Thankfully, NASA only found water on Mars. If they had found beef, we would have to kill all Martians." Now, that is a kind of dilemma in which I find myself today. Now, just few well-known facts about religion and social stability. The biblical saying is, "Man cannot live by bread alone." It is also true that from the earliest times, men have been incurably religious. Thinkers in all times and at all places have agreed in regarding Indians as a religious-minded people. In the words of Sir Harcourt Butler, the Indians are essentially religious, as Europeans are essentially secular. religion is still the alpha and omega of Indian life. I'm hugely impressed by reference to yoga by my predecessor, but let me tell you, in India, as this government-sponsored celebration of yoga started, there were voices, and these voices were not from the religious minorities, from the liberal majority community itself. And they said, we would accept it. You remove this Surya Namaskar, this is worshipping of sun, from this, and it was removed by the government. Then it was said that, well, Muslim prayer, namaz, is also one kind of yoga. So yoga in India was celebrated as something which was giving religious freedom, and the Hindu element from yoga was removed by the government itself. I'm also, before I go further, would like to bring to the notice of this August gathering. Yesterday in the keynote address, a reference was made to death penalty. We have got the latest report from the Law Commission just a month ago, and the Commission has said that for all offenses, the death penalty should go, except for offenses relating to terror. Of course, as a student of law, I believe that this distinction between terror and non-terror crimes is wrong, and in sentencing, we should rather look at criminal rather than crime. There was a reference in keynote speech to hate speech and how it affects social stability. I would make a reference to that. There was a reference in the keynote speech that there should be no coercion in matters of belief. I find that there are some states in India which are coming up with anti-conversion laws, and there are other regulations which are impinging on religious freedom. So I would briefly refer to that. Father of Indian nation, Gandhiji was convinced that genuine religion constructed bridges of solidarity between people. Authentic religion speaks of harmony, not of sectarianism. Most religions talk of rights of fellow human beings. In Islam, they make a distinction between huququllah, the rights of God, and huququl ibad, the rights of people. And they say it is the rights of people, other people, which are far more important. We know now that there are benefits of freedom of religion. Religious freedom promotes well-being of individuals, families, and community. It leads to reduction in incidents of domestic violence, crime, substance abuse, and addiction. Happy people tend to be productive and law-abiding, and if you have freedom of religion, you will get good citizens. Now, religious freedom, I believe, is also perceived and premised on the belief that every human being has inherent dignity to explore his or her conscience to pursue the truth. And therefore, I am opposed to any anti-conversion law. The other aspect of India's freedom of religion is that religious freedom is also essential for religious reforms. So if we want to reform the outdated Christian law, outdated Hindu law, outdated Muslim law, we need to permit religious freedom, because the reinterpretation of religion will initiate that reform process. I say it with great pride that the majority community was the first to lead us. They reformed their laws in 50s itself, and there are liberal elements within the minority communities who are seeking similar reforms at the moment. Now that brings me straight away to what is our demography. The latest religious census has been made public. Hindus constitute 79.8% of our population. Muslims are 14.23%. Christians are 2.3% in spite of so much of talk of conversion. Now, just a quick point. Why did we adopt secularism? Indian secularism is not creating or erecting a wall of separation between church and state. Taking the European experience as a referent point of secularism, some scholars have argued that secularism is an alien concept for and in India, and that it does not match either the configuration of society or convictions of the people. These scholars seem to forget that perhaps there were very good reasons for adopting secularism as an organizing principle of Indian society, reasons that were both moral as well as pragmatic. They forget that secularism presented perhaps the only option to regulate intergroup behavior. A reference was made, if we want social stability, we need to manage this group dynamics. They forget that secularism presented perhaps the only option to regulate intergroup behavior, at least in the circumstances that have snared Indian society since the early decades of 20th century. I suggest that secularism was adopted as an organizing principle of Indian society, at least for 3 reasons. The first reason had to do with both the management of perhaps irreconcilable tensions between religious groups, as well as the need to spell out the relationship of the state with different religious groups. Ironically, it is often forgotten that secularism in India has been devised precisely to negotiate interreligious relationships, to grant the freedom of religious belief, to ensure equality of all the religious groups, and to assure that minorities that their identities would be safe. So we don't believe in the melting pot theory. We rather believe in the salad bowl theory, where the distinctive identities of all religious communities in India are to be preserved and celebrated. It was in pursuance of these objectives that the first Prime Minister of India was to declare, and I quote, "The government of a country like India, with many religions that have secured great and devoted following for generations, can never function satisfactorily in a modern age except on a secular basis." Accordingly, the first principle of secularism codified the assurance that everyone has freedom to practice their religion via Article 25 of the Fundamental Rights chapter of the Constitution. Now, just as freedom of religion does not necessarily need secularism to support it, equality of religions can be established via the fundamental right of equality. But if we were to stop at this, secularism would be rendered redundant. For secularism extends beyond equality and freedom to declare that the state is not aligned to any particular religion. It is this particular commitment that establishes the credentials of a secular state. A secularism, we can say, outstripping provisions for freedom and equality, stipulates that a state will maintain an attitude of principled distance from all religious groups. It also contracts that a state would neither align itself with any particular religion, especially the majority religion, not pursue any religious task of its own. And this is what is under threat at the moment, that there is a feeling within the liberals in our country that the present government is promoting the majoritarian view of religion. Now, let me very quickly talk to you what kind of freedom of religion we have in India and from where the threat comes. You will be surprised. At one level, the state and the governments are more than willing to grant maximum religious freedom, maybe because of the vote politics. And it is the judiciary which has been restricting freedom of religion. So if you look at the freedom of religion jurisprudence in India, it is the courts which have been saying, what will be your religious freedom, we would decide. So we in India do not follow the assertion test. It is the court which will decide what is an essential aspect of my religion. So what is my religion? Scriptures don't decide in India. It is the law and the courts which decide. And I'm not willing to accept it. I believe the court should not play the role of the clergy. And this court has been applying across board. It is not only about minorities, even about Hindu religion. Court has been saying that this is essential and this is not essential. Recently, there was a decision from the Rajasthan High Court not permitting Santhara kind of a suicide where some Jain community people want to end their life peacefully. And this has been happening about Muslims. They say mosque is not a central or essential tenet of Islam. So this is one level of restriction on freedom of religion which creates tensions between communities, and I believe our government is not at fault on this count. But there are some state governments which have come up with laws which do not permit conversion. Even though in the Constitution, in Article 25, in the Constituent Assembly debates, this word propagate was specifically inserted on the request of the Christian community to take care of their conversions. I believe that the decision of the Supreme Court again holding that law constitutional is wrong. And there have been numerous other laws which have been coming up which are in a way curtailing religious freedom. But the latest threat which comes to freedom of religion and rather to create social instability in my country comes from hate speech and the kind of statements which are made by the minority of leaders. It is still an aberration, as I said. So there are people who feel, I'm quoting Julio Ribeiro, who was a DGP of Punjab, a Christian. He said, "Today in the 86th year, I feel threatened, not wanted, reduced to a stranger in my own country, the same country of citizens who had put their trust in me to rescue them from a force they could not comprehend, have now come out of woodwork to condemn me for practicing a religion that is different from theirs. I am not an Indian anymore, at least in the eyes of the proponents of Hindu Rashtra." This was the man who has put down terrorism in Punjab. Then similarly, we get riots, and in many riots, there is a program. In fact, there are now researches which I did after my return from China, and report after reports, they say that communal riots take place when genocide is not an option. So if you want to instill fear in the minds of the minority, then you will have riots here and there. And all reports, I'll just quote a leaked report. This report was submitted just about 5 days ago about the Muzaffarnagar riot. And the report says like this: "Soon after the killing, a survivor told independent groups making preliminary inquiries that a police inspector accompanying the rioters was forcefully abating the murderers. Kill, quickly, kill as many as you can." At one point, the inspector got angry to see that rioters were not doing their job ruthlessly. He shouted, and I quote, "Bastard, what is wrong with you? Why can't you kill more?" Now, if you have this kind of situation, then of course, social stability will become a distant dream. I am confident that our government will take all measures. The Prime Minister in last 15 months or so has taken very positive actions. In his first Independence Day speech last year, he said, "Let us have moratorium on communal riots for 1 full decade." He has not made any divisive statement, and I am sure that he would be able to rein in these elements. But some of the recent hate speeches which are coming from the members of the ruling party. So one MP, Yogi Adityanath from Uttar Pradesh, he said, "We will install Gauri Ganesh," these are the Hindu gods, "in every mosque." He also said that Hindus should dig out dead bodies of Muslim women and rape them. Hindus should marry 100 Muslim women for every Hindu marrying a Muslim woman. They have been made too much of hue and cry about so-called love jihad, saying that Muslim boys, are alluring Hindu women to marry them, which is nonsense, which has not been proved anywhere. Similarly, the influence of the extremist cultural organization called RSS on the present government creates doubts in the minds of the liberals in my country. They have been on record to say that India belongs to Hindus. Hindustan is our nation, a Rashtra of Hindus. Now we are in a position to weigh and assert our power, which ensures our success. Currently, circumstances are in our favor, referring to the accession of the Prime Minister in May 2014. They are also, in a big way, defending Ghar Wapsi, the reconversion. Now, the Supreme Court decision says freedom of religion does not involve and include conversion, but then reconversion is also conversion. And in a big way, they are saying that let us have a central law prohibiting conversion. Similarly, there are killing of rationalists lately. There have been ministers in the union government who have not been very prudent when it comes to making speeches. They have been making highly provocative speeches. So one of the allies of the present government, Siena in Rajasthan, One Mr. Sanjay Rawat has said that we must scrap voting rights of Muslim community. We have a cultural minister. We were making a reference to culture and religion. The Union Cultural Minister, for instance, was saying about our former president who recently died that APJ Abdul Kalam was a nationalist despite being Muslim. He was also saying that we must have a religious conversion law. He was saying women shouldn't go out, so it is not about minorities alone. This man is some outdated creation who wants to take back country backward many, many centuries. But I have a great hope, and this hope of mine comes from my government. It comes from the majority community. I assure you that the majority community of India is totally tolerant, believes in social solidarity, believes in freedom of religion, and whatever criticism of the present government or extremist element or hate speech or communal riots you see in the country, it is not the minorities who are leading the opposition. The opposition, and this is the blessing, the opposition comes from the majority community itself. The opposition comes from the government itself. Hope, as great Martin Wright once said, is not a political virtue, but it is a religious one. It will take the best of faith to defeat the worst of the religious nationalism and build an Indian society whose growth in GDP, as in religious freedom, can be counted on in the long term. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Brigham Young University for inviting me to come and speak at the 22nd Annual International Law and Religion Symposium. As Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, it is a great pleasure to be here and to speak to you all today. As Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, I have prioritised very strongly a focus of my work onto this issue of religious freedom. Now, I come at it not as a lawyer. My interest and background is in the realm of public policy, and I am personally irreligious, which brings me into a particularly interesting space, I'm sure, for most people interested in the discussion around religious freedom. But I do so because I see it as incredibly important as part of the structure and fabric of our nation, but also so many of the significant challenges we face as an international community. When I look at Australia's demography, changing social and cultural norms, migration patterns, and changed attitudes towards religion, it's clear that religious freedom is going to be one of the most significant human rights challenges we face for our nation into the near future. There is no singular driver. The rise of people who identify with no religion, the increase in the number of people who identify with a religion other than Christianity, particularly those born overseas, and the rise of other non-governmental sources of authority, all bring religious freedom into the spotlight, among others. Yet, against this backdrop, religious freedom is and remains central to the Australian way of life. Preserving freedom of thought, conscience, expression and association is central to achieving the religious freedom objective that we have as a nation, because these fundamental freedoms are essential for individuality and identity. Constitutionally, our great nation is secular. The government is neutral in matters of religion. That secularism allows society to be truly pluralist in every sense of the word, not just for religion, but also for other expressions of an individual's identity and their willingness to participate in society. In his speech to the 1897 Constitutional Convention, our first Prime Minister encapsulated the view of the role of government over religion at the time that was founded in our federation, that the whole mode of government, the whole province of the state, is secular. The whole duty is to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God. That is the line of division maintained in every state in which there is not a predominant church, government which dictates to all civil institutions. The best plan which can be adopted as a proposal of this kind in talking about our constitution, which is also likely to create dissension foreign to the objects of of any church or any Christian community is that secular expressions should be left to secular matters while prayer should be left to its proper place. But the secular nature of Australia's government does not limit it from funding religious organisations, as is deemed necessary to achieve a public policy benefit. And we have many schools and hospitals owned, managed, run according to faith traditions, but that are funded by the Australian taxpayer to achieve that objective. But once we enter the contemporary political domain, the perceived role and place of religious freedom is much more mixed. Like all issues of rights in the Australian context, religious freedom does not sit in isolation. Rights sit in a basket of contested political values, supported by Australians, including rights, freedoms, responsibility, justice, and fairness. Solely appealing to one of these values will rarely win you an argument in the court of Australian public opinion. Religion was once the most powerful source of authority outside of government. It did sit in a privileged position amongst liberties. However, the concurrent rise of people without any religion and a cultural attachment to religion, which may not result in people attending services or being in some sort of organised structure, has meant that the position of authority has declined. Similarly, there has been a rise of alternate sources of authority, such as the environment, secular ethics and equality, and social justice movements. For some, religion holds no authority, and for others it retains, obviously, a significant status. But I suspect for most people in our country, its authority is dependent on what it adds to themselves and to our society. To that extent, moral authority depends on integrity. That's why preaching Puritanism, while faiths don't have their own houses in order, often falls flat and actually opens them up to ridicule. In response to the declining status, the increasing effort of some to claim victimhood on the basis of their faith has not been a very effective strategy. Instead, it has been scoffed at and dismissed by those individuals and groups that have either traditionally had limited power or feel that they have been victim to the influence and power of religion in the past. I can understand why some people feel their religious liberty is being curtailed, and in many ways, I strongly agree with them. But I equally think that religious freedom has enjoyed that position of privilege in the past and is now exposed to the same vulnerabilities as other freedoms, and it's simply getting used to a new reality. With an established democracy, mature laws, and an economy that fulfills our material needs, our society increasingly searches for guidance about how to resolve the great areas of people's relationships to each other. Civil society makes an enormous contribution to this task, and civil society smooths over the gaps between different arms of government and the private sector, and it builds and binds community and engenders a culture of respect and trust, as well as the importance of organic forms of relationships, particularly the family. Religion has an enormously important role as part of our civil society. In a truly pluralistic society, it provides an important source of non-governmental consideration and authority on public policy matters, as well as consideration of matters of morality. Not all morality comes from religion, but religion certainly has a legacy of informing public understanding of morality and what is necessary to do a just and to inform just laws and economic transactions. Denying freedom through through equality of the law compromises stability in a free society. Law must treat and respect everybody equally. Equality before the law is the foundation of social stability and cohesion, built on a system of formal equality for all citizens. But when law is used as a tool to deny the exercise of basic liberties, it only fosters resentment and undermines social stability and social cohesion. Perceptions of the inconsistent application of the law regularly feeds resentment in our country. For instance, when national security laws are perceived to target one section of our multicultural, multi-faith society. So too it breeds resentment when laws are used to target the development of religious houses of worship or to stop people wearing religious clothing. There is no one driver of that resentment. But sadly, resentment about perceptions of discriminatory law and social participation has contributed to Australia having a disturbingly high rate of young individuals, mostly Muslim men, becoming sufficiently radicalised that they feel it necessary to jump on planes and fight in wars that have nothing to do with them, and often then to commit horrific acts in the process. We're about to face another round of questions about the use of law to silence and censor people's opinions based primarily on what people would see as an extension of their faith, as we increasingly deal with the difficult task of stopping speech that leads to acts of violence, but where the speech may not directly incite violence as a result of people's individual behaviour. We had an experience of that in Sydney only late last week, when a 15-year-old boy was allegedly cultivated by extremists operating out of a Sydney mosque to eventually kill others. But resentment also develops when religion uses their values to impose an inequality in the law, and the perennial debates about the equal protection of same-sex attracted individuals and their relationships is the most obvious contemporary example. Some faiths do not have a proud history in this space. For example, many opposed efforts only 40 years ago to decriminalise consenting sexual acts between adults. I argue that such an approach is politically foolish, but also inconsistent with a moral society that believes in religious freedom. Because for a society to be moral, people must be free to choose an alternate path, but ultimately choose a path towards morality and righteousness. It's in this context that I strongly believe the future of religious freedom rests in the hands of faiths. Religions have a choice. They can recognise the reality and use it as the basis for a broader compact about the enlarging freedom of all, or oppose broader social changes inconsistent with their beliefs and risk being cast aside as being unreasonable. I have to say my very deep concern, not just in my own country, but also in the United States and many other Western liberal democracies, that is the path that we are heading down. The latter, that rather than religious faiths being part of an open discussion about enlarging the freedom of everybody, that they are instead being isolated and marginalised because they are seen as seeking to advance their views at the expense of others, and in the process are only compromising religious freedom, not just for themselves, but for everybody. Because advancing religious freedom in 21st century Australia and in most Western liberal democracies is intrinsically linked to respecting and advancing the rights of others. Religion isn't a trump card to justify curtailing other people's liberties. In essence, if you want your rights and freedoms respected, then you have to respect the rights and freedoms of others. No one, of course, credibly contests the rights of those of faith to believe as they wish and to act consistent with their faith when it has no impact on others. But when we talk about the manifestation of religious freedom beyond oneself, it can quickly interact with the rights of others. Preserving religious freedom has to come with a recognition with the parallels between those of faith and others being free to act consistent with their conscience. I believe strongly in the need to accommodate the freedom for people to act consistent with their conscience in law. But any accommodation has to require that an individual acts consistently and that it can be evidenced as their genuine belief. It cannot be a selective application or an opt-out when they don't just want to do something because it doesn't seem to suit their agenda. Any threshold that accommodates some act of conscience should be set high and transparent. And it's to this end that I've been working very closely with religious communities in our country about how to design laws that can work towards accommodating religious freedom as part of changes reflecting contemporary social and cultural attitudes. The most substantive work I've done in this space to date has been to propose a reform law around our marriage laws that seeks to enlarge the freedom of same-sex couples to be able to access civil marriage, while also working to protect the tradition of religious marriage and an enlarged space for the people not to act against their conscience. Now, the way we've sought to do this in broad terms is to recognise that we all look at marriage very differently. As somebody who is irreligious, I do not look at it with the same degree of importance around religious foundation and freedom, but I recognise that other people do. At the same time, people like myself and others recognise that it has a very important role, both culturally, socially, and in a legal sense, around the basic recognition of people's relationships and the solidification of commitment between two adults in a free society. The way we've sought to advance protecting religious marriage while also advancing a more open and accepting form of civil marriage is to separate the two out in law, but to treat them equally in law. And then off the back of that, we can then have a discussion about what necessary legal protections exist for people who seek to have a religious or conscience-based marriage. Of course, there's a strong debate about how far a person's capacity to act consistent with their conscience can actually be protected. But it seems to me that we should work to enlarge this space so long as it does no substantive harm to others. So the proposal we developed was built on that understanding of the importance of marriage, but its different understandings for different people in a free society. And that by dividing the civil and religious institutions in law, we would have a greater but more nuanced capacity to enable people to not be forced to act against their conscience. The intention of the proposal that we put forward after extensive engagement between not just religious communities but also those people who would benefit, particularly the LGBT community, was not sought to be a compromise. Instead, it was seeking to accommodate people's deeply held conscientious views about people being exposed to different forms of retribution in case there was people who were facing backlashes because they were not keen in participating in a marriage between same-sex couples. How Australia seeks to resolve this debate will be instructive, obviously, for the substantive proposal on the table. But it will also be incredibly important for the future of religious freedom more generally. If it is approached sensibly and respectfully, it can be used to enhance the standing of religious freedom in many other matters, looking at how we accommodate religious freedom through law. And I think it would enjoy a greater degree of support from the general public if we got a pathway forward that engaged and recognised the importance of religious freedom while also getting buy-in and support from those people from faiths. This particular debate will have a significant influence on the public's debate to religious freedom more generally. The tone of the public's attitude towards religious freedom the day after reforms is, of course, heavily informed by the tone that is had the day before in public debate. Having a healthy tone and having a healthy accommodation for religious freedom as part of any law reform, recognising those contemporary political and cultural attitudes, is very dependent on a sense of good faith. It is achieved through an accommodation built on a mutual respect for the rights and the freedoms of all. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We've been delighted by the presentation so far. Now, as promised, everyone can stand for just a moment and stretch their legs, and then we're going to have the great opportunity for questions and answers. So if you want to rise, we'll just stand for 1 minute, and then we'll go directly to questions and answers. Okay, if you would mind taking your seats, we'll begin with our questions and answers. Now we want to make sure, do we have the students with the microphones? We have one over here, one over here. Okay, great. All right, so if everyone will take their seat and put on their headphone or get their headphone ready. Well, we've been, let's see, are the microphones working? Are the microphones working? Test, test, okay. Well, please take your seats again. We would like to have an orderly discussion with questions and answers. It's very important, as we mentioned yesterday, that each of the persons called on to ask a question speak into a microphone. The translators will not be able to hear you unless you use the microphone. So we will begin with this hand right here in the middle. And please state your name and the country you're from as part of your question. And we would encourage you to please just ask questions, not give long background information.
I'm sorry. My name is Ashok. I'm from India. I'm sorry, but the nature of the question is because the nature of the statement was not in line with what I feel is the issue at point. The first statement by Professor Marco Ventura about, firstly, that I'd like to say that Hinduism and Buddhism both are creations, not just Buddhism. The second is, of course, it's Prime Minister Modi. The third is that yoga is a discipline. It is not a religion in that sense. It just happens to have emerged from the Hindu system. And there is breath, there is exercise, there is stillness and meditation, which serves to focus the mind. And what Professor Mustafa has mentioned about Surya Namaskar, it is merely a way in which to exercise every muscle of the body. You can stand in the sun and absorb your vitamin D. So I don't understand why this whole approach is of trying to link yoga with a particular faith when it does not necessarily have any connection with faith as such. It just emerged from that faith. And lastly, I would like to mention in connection with Mr. Mustafa that you say India is one country where you don't still have a civil law, and you have Muslim law. So this is itself an indication of how far the majority community has gone in terms of providing the facility for the minority community. Even Middle Eastern countries have got civil law. Turkey has Muslim law, in spite of being Islamic. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's answer those questions. Professor Ventura first, and then Professor Mustafa.
What interests me with President Modi's statements on yoga is not whether I agree or everybody agrees on his understanding of yoga. My interest for his statement is that he gives a definition, as you did, of what yoga is, against the background of a very lively debate on what yoga is, so many schools, so many experts, and that he links his statement with national policies and with his position in government. I mean, my argument stays there. This is what interests me. This is what interests me as the challenge with which we are confronted when we deal with transformations and global transformations or law and religion, especially as that statement is about yoga going global, yoga going worldwide, and there's a national element in there. So this is what interests me. Now, as far as I'm not a scholar in this area, but I happened to review the last Italian edition of the Yoga Sutra. And it's a fairly short text, but the edition is preceded by about 150 pages of background and literature. And I can tell you that if that's the state of the debate on yoga, has an historical emergence as a contemporary phenomenon, I think that any sharp and final definition of what yoga is and what is not is very, very precarious. Thank you.
Professor Mustafa.
Just two responses. One, the Surya Namaskar, it may be an exercise in the sun to get vitamin D, but the hymns which are recited, and since some of the ulema, they said that we are more than willing to accept yoga as an exercise, if this so-called Surya Namaskar, where you bow to sun, is removed and hymns are removed, and the government was more than willing, and therefore the government did it. And I appreciate the government for doing this, because then everybody joined yoga. All Muslims also joined yoga. To the second question, I did refer in my presentation that the majority community led the reform in their laws. Because this was one of my points, that if you guarantee freedom of religion, then reinterpretation of religious texts would be possible. If you don't guarantee freedom of religion, the religious reforms won't take place. So religious reforms have taken place in the majority community in the 50s, and I said that the minority communities would soon follow the suit. The Christian law was also highly outdated. Few years back, we reformed Christian law. About Muslim law also, there has been a legislative activity. There have been laws starting from 1939 itself, where there has been a process of reform. But on the question of uniform civil code, while it is one of the directive principles that the state shall endeavor to have a uniform civil code, we do not have a uniform code in India, not because of religions, but because of the territoriality. So Hindus in, for instance, Kashmir or in Pondicherry are not governed by the central Hindu laws. So Muslims in Kashmir are also not governed by the Muslim law. There are any number of provisions, say adoption for instance, say the distinction in inheritance between the married daughters and unmarried daughters, it is unknown to Islam, but it is practiced in Kashmir. So from state to state, law differs. Even in Goa, where you have a kind of a uniform civil code for almost 40 years, Muslims are still governed by Hindu law. You know, India is a unique country. You know, you have Muslim communities in India who believe in 10 incarnations of Vishnu. And therefore, they are still governed by the Hindu law. Muslims are governed by Hindu law. So we need to have that kind of understanding, and the position which Government of India has been repeatedly taking, that let the initiative for reform come from the minority community itself. About the Muslim countries, wherever you are in a majority, it is easy. But minority communities have this minority psyche. That's why even Muslim law in Pakistan and Bangladesh is far more reform than the Indian Muslim law. Indian Muslim law is most conservative and outdated law. But we need to wait for the appropriate time for that kind of reform to take place.
Thank you. Okay, down here from Canada.
Thank you. Palbinder Shergill from Canada. Thanks, first of all, for all the excellent speeches by all of the presenters. Mine is for Professor Mustafa. You were speaking early on in your presentation about the Indian Constitution and how you believe that as a document itself, it was excellent in terms of protection of religious freedoms. Now, I know that there has been some pushback, though, from religious minority communities, such as the Sikh community, particularly because of Article 25. And there's a reference in Article 25 that I think the way that it reads a subclause, right? So that the reference to Hindus shall be construed as including a reference to persons professing the Sikh, Jain, or Buddhist religion. And so the Sikh community has, I think, worked really hard to try to have that particular clause removed so that the Sikhs are identified as a separate religion. My question to you is, I know that there was an amendment that was proposed in the in Parliament a few years ago. What's the status of that particular constitutional amendment?
Yeah. In fact, there has been this kind of criticism of Indian Constitution that while defining Hindus, it includes Buddhists and Jains and Sikhs, and the present government, is in alliance with Shrimani Akali Dal government of Prakash Singh Badal, and some 20 years ago, Prakash Singh Badal used to burn copies of Article 25 because it includes Sikhs within the definition of Hindus. So, ideally, it should not include, since there is an assertion by a community saying that we follow a distinct religion, and we have a distinct religious text, and therefore they should be recognized ideally as a separate community. But then you have to remember that in 1956 or so, Sikhs did argue, and the presidential order on scheduled caste was amended. Now, this is another point I want to make while responding to them, that one of the contentious issues in India has been that in the definition of scheduled caste who are entitled to affirmative action in jobs, it is available to Hindus only. Originally, it was available to Hindus only, and then with this demand being raised by Sikhs and Buddhists were added. Now, what the religious minorities like Muslims and Dalit Christians have been arguing all these years, and there is a petition pending in the Supreme Court on this issue, that the Christian community in India also has a caste system, which you have in Hinduism, and Muslim community in India also has a caste system, as you have in the Hindu community. Therefore, this disincentive for conversion must go, because your status in terms of social mobility really doesn't go up on conversion, whatever Christianity or Islam may be talking about egalitarianism. On the ground, the situation does not really change. And this is a discrimination solely on the basis of religion, that you give affirmative action policy benefit only to the Hindus. So I'm with you, but that amendment has no future. So I'm inclined to believe that unless there is re-emergence of that demand in a big way, because Sikhs have also over the years given up that demand, I have not heard anywhere they asking now. A few years back, Jains asserted that they are to be given a religious minority status. They went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court again gave a very outdated conservative judgment saying that we should not be adding more minorities. We should rather have one country, one nation, one language kind of thing. But then about a year, 2 years ago, before UPA government went out, through an executive, they have included Jains as a separate minority. But for Sikhs, while in Punjab, they are a minority community entitled to all the benefits in terms of establishment of educational institutions and management of educational institutions. But as far as the definition of Hindu goes, I think Sikhs would continue to be included within the definition of Hindus, which is not a great thing to happen from the perspective of freedom of religion and diversity.
Okay, another question. Let's see. Yes, here in the front.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one question.
Please introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Murtala Bidmos, Professor of Islamic Education from University of Lagos, Islamic Education and Interreligious Dialogue. I have only one question, and this question is for the three speakers. Either all of them or any of them can take it. In your presentations, there are two major variables: religious freedom and social stability. Those are the two variables on the table. But there is another variable which is implied but not written. That is, what is the essence of religion? What role can religion play in enhancing social stability? That is what is important to us. Freedom of religion is a fundamental human right. Everybody must have it. And the law must protect everybody in the society to have freedom of religion. But when we are talking about social stability, what contribution do we expect religion to make in making it a reality? That variable is implied, but you have not been addressed it. Why are you ignoring it?
Okay. Mr. Wilson, why don't you take that question?
That's on, sorry. That's a big question. And that's why, and there's no perfect answer to the question, but I would have thought in terms of social stability, what you want is everybody to think, to believe that the system of laws that operate within a society and their application is done on the basis of equal treatment and respect for them as an individual and respect for them and their religious freedom and their capacity to exercise it in their society. Because what we've seen consistently is it's when law doesn't do that, or it seeks to be unequally applied, that people build a sense of social resentment towards the structures of the society that's supposed to govern them, and that can lead to backlashes of all different types. So, and I think it also has to, in the end, be a system of law that accommodates people's religious beliefs in law. Secularism does, in our country at least, secularism is something we apply to the government, which is that it must be a neutral party in discussions around matters that govern our society. But society is pluralist. It is one where everybody has the capacity to have their own individual identity, to associate with the people that they see fit, and to live their lives according to that. And so long as you build a society built on that sense of equality before the law, but also fostering a culture of respect for individuality and everybody's individual identity, I think you do the most to drive a respect for, an outcome for social stability, because everybody has an inherent pact on the benefits of respecting others, but also in preserving and protecting the system of government and society that we have.
Thank you. Let's see. Professor Lindholm, did you have a question? Oh, no. Okay, Judge Wallace. Oh, okay, Judge Wallace.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening discussion. It strikes me that you've come to the heart of one of our major challenges, and as who gets to decide? You've made it very clear that there are pluses and minuses, but in the ultimate end is who gets to decide, the court or through the democratic process. Through, for example, a same-sex marriage, our country, by one vote of the Supreme Court, decided that the court would make that decision over a very strong dissent by our Chief Justice, who pointed out that the Constitution didn't allow for that to be decided at the national level. It was to be decided at the state level by the ballot box. So we chose to go by the courts. But in Australia, as I understand it, Mr. Wilson, there was a real determination to make this a political process in which there could be compromises, that those who wanted same-sex marriage, there had to be with it protection of religion, and that is built into the process. Could you explain how that happened and whether or not there's any hint that somehow this is going to get to the High Court regardless of what you do?
You're giving me like these really simple questions to answer. The story of the debate in Australia is, of course, we've been having it now for on and off for about 15, 20 years, depending on where you sit and how long you've been engaging with the issue. It seemed to me that particularly after the Irish referendum and the US Supreme Court decision, a decision which I agree with the outcome, but I disagree with the process and the reasoning, that we were going to have invited on us very quickly a renewed discussion on this issue to be resolved by the Parliament. Again, something I strongly support and I think we should get out of the way. But what became abundantly clear to me, and not just to me but many others, was that there had not been a proper and robust discussion about the need for protection of religious freedom and conscientious objection. In fact, the primary proposals that we've had put before us is you exclude religious institutions and ministers of faith being required to oversee a marriage between two men or two women, and that was sufficient. And what I disagree with that proposal, and there are many people, of course, who disagree with that proposal. So what we did was try to sit down with a whole bunch of different people from the different constituent bases to have a discussion about how far the law could go one way in accommodating religious freedom, while also recognising that the law was going to change, and I'm still a belief the law was going to change. And to get a sort of constructive buy-in from religious groups. In practice, we developed a proposal, we developed essentially a bill, but unfortunately it was never put to the Parliament at this stage. Instead, what we have now is a commitment for the government to go towards a public vote, a position which I oppose very strongly, least because it diminishes the capacity to have that nuanced discussion at a parliamentary level. Technically, if we have a public vote, which is called a plebiscite, it gets put to the public, they vote and will send their indication one way or another. But the degree to which there is then much of a debate after that about the nuances of it, I think, is going to be pretty scarce. My hope is that we can resurrect at least significant components of the bill that we proposed so that it can be put before the Parliament and they can properly consider it. Because in the end, if you want to take your country together after an issue like this where people have deeply held views on both sides, you have to accommodate and recognise the inherent tensions that exist around people's relationships and their religious liberty and the definition of one of the world's most significant long-standing institutions. And my fear is that we're not heading in that direction again. I've done everything I can to try and circumvent that, as have many others. But unfortunately, I have to say a large part of the problem has been those of faith who simply are prepared to be unwilling to compromise. And I think they have endangered religious freedom for themselves because they think it would be better to go down in a burning ship rather than to recognise the reality.
Okay, now Professor Lindholm.
Thank you. I come from Oslo, the Norwegian Center of Human Rights, and I'm a human rights person. I have a question mostly to Tim Wilson.
Is the translation coming through? Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay, I go ahead. I want to touch matters that you just touched, but never mind. Because I quote you, I think, verbatim. Law or laws must protect everybody equally. And then you added, people should be free to choose what is right or wrong, choose their morality. But then you added, consistent with their conscience. Then you also added, there should be no substantive harm to others in what they may choose.
I didn't get that last part. What was it?
There should be no substantive harm to others.
Right.
Yeah, okay. This is the way I understand you. And then I ask you again, what should be the law on such matters in a secular pluralist arrangement that you present to us?
Sure.
Where what one religion or one life stance or one worldview, let's say a secularist one, holds to be sacred or very important or mandatory, whereas another thing is disgusting. Mm-hmm. And that happens, although you make everything you say, you have the respect. People should listen to their conscience, and you should not do harm to others. Because what is harm to others is also a question of discussion.
It's a huge question.
Yeah, and then how do you go about that? I am thinking of something which I believe, but I don't know much about it, has happened in the state of Utah in this year, where you had a regulation on, where you had the what do you call it? LGBT people, yes. Secularists, I think mostly, and Mormon people, the high up, reaching a wonderful compromise. Well, mm-hmm. I praise it, where no party got what their conscience tells them full, because you couldn't have it. I mean, it has to, I don't know, I don't think it has to do with marriage so much, but it will come up now after the Supreme Court that you mentioned, Judge. But it had to do with the housing, it had to do with employment, and of course what they dodged, but they have to deal with it, is how about the transactions in the marketplace?
Sure.
This famous case of the baker who doesn't want to bake for a homosexual couple, and the photographer who doesn't want to take photography of a lesbian couple, and so on. Do you have, from your principle, sort of, from your background, a principled way of dealing with this? If you have one, could you please share it with us?
Well, there's no one definition of harm. Everybody, if you watch contemporary debates, some people would say that somebody simply saying something that they find offensive is sufficient harm that it now needs to be censored or silenced. I don't hold that view. I think harm has to be a substantive, it has to be substantial in its nature, and also that there doesn't, harm has to occur where some alternative isn't easily available. So in the compromise proposal we were talking about, for instance, with our marriage laws, there was a recognition that people could say there was a conscientious objection to participate in weddings in certain circumstances. It had to be pre-registered. They had to have an established tradition of holding consistent with that position. But equally, that they were then honour-bound to, by law, to refer people to alternate service providers so that those people were no less off. You can facilitate the conscientious objection, but they have to provide an avenue for other people. That, of course, is not a view that a lot of people agree with. My position is much bolder in the Australian context than what most people would accept, and including in the United States, where ordinarily if you have a business or you have some sort of commercial enterprise, that you treat people without any discrimination, regardless of the circumstances. I think you can, particularly when you're getting to such a touchstone issue, facilitate that. But I think the only way that you can get, one, a proper recognition and respect for the need for conscientious objection is to make sure that those who wish to exercise that conscientious objection are sitting around the table engaging in the discussion. And that's where, I pay recognition to what was achieved in Utah, rather than having a long-standing zero-sum argument which led to contest. You actually had a negotiation, a discussion to say, well, how do we achieve the preservation and respect of both groups of rights? Is there a principle-based perspective? Only to the extent that it's based on a recognition of preserving the rights and freedoms of everybody. But in the end, rights and freedoms sit within a context of other political values. They do not sit in isolation, and even amongst rights themselves, if you're looking at, say, equality before the law versus religious freedom, people place different emphasis based on their cultural understanding and their background. But one thing I would correct you on is not all LGBT people are secular. Many of them are of faith and actually have a high degree of respect for faith. But there are plenty of people who are irreligious who are very secular or arguably secularist in their nature. And so we need to recognise that we have to work with the parties who are prepared to come to an accommodation. And that is the way forward if you want to enlarge the space for religious freedom in debates around public policy and law.
Just for clarification, in Australia, does religious marriage have civil effect?
Yes.
Okay, so that's our foundation. Yes, now we had a question over here. Yeah, yes, you can. Everyone needs to put on their headphones and just give us a moment to do that.
Good morning.
The question will be in Portuguese.
Em primeiro lugar, parabéns pelas apresentações.
And congratulations on all the presentations. I'm Moroni Torgan, a congressman from Brazil, member of the Brazilian Congress. And first, I'd like to clarify our Constitution for everyone to act according to their own happiness. However, it defines in one of the provisions the family is marriage between a man and a woman. That is defined in our Constitution as far as the family goes. And there's legislation under Constitution that is now percolating in the Congress that reaffirms the constitutional principle. So just to clarify this point regarding family, but that's not my question. I believe that law defines the limits of the association of religions that preach violence. that's not a problem because the law defines the limitations. But how to live with religions that preach aggression, cultural or verbal aggression in the media and other means? That's what I'd like to know from all of you. How can we live and maybe help them not to do that? I'd like to have an answer from all of you in this regard.
All right, Professor Ventura, maybe you could begin.
Well, I think that that's precisely because debate on hate speech is so relevant for our developments in the area of law and religion. I believe that we have to combine two competing principles here. One principle is that we need to be very contextual. I mean, a statement that might sound very threatening in a given context because of the very specific circumstances there might be absolutely tolerable in another context. And we are learning this, and through our global conversation. And this is a very difficult exercise because, second principle, because of the fact that we are engaged in a global conversation and because of the fact that what we do in one country will most likely have effects in another country, we also constantly seeking out for common principles, common definitions. And I think that we can, it's just a matter of a very patient exercise. There's no other way to try to combine these two principles. To be very careful, pay a lot of attention to contexts, and at the same time engage in a conversation about what can be defined as an international standard. Having said this, I think that personally, when you deal with religious freedom, there's something which is sometimes, it's probably the elephant in the room to some extent. I mean, if you genuinely want religious freedom, there is a high risk that you have to accept. Religious freedom does not come to a cheap price for anybody, And I believe that this should be accepted as a very fundamental element in our discussion. When we speak about stability, I mean, so much of religion is not about stability, it's about change, sometimes disruptive change. And very often religions themselves do not know where they're going, precisely because they cannot anticipate the will of God, or they cannot anticipate what people will do out of their desire to follow the will of God. And I believe that when we draw the line between what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, we have to be careful to allow as much as possible for those kinds of religious manifestations that precisely sound not in line with what is reassuring to us, because they are threatening they are threatening from within of our own tradition, legal or religious, or because they are very alien, including the fact that religion is constantly transforming. I mean, we are here, we shared yesterday this fantastic moment, but we precisely because we are here, we are very aware of the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ in the Latter-day Saints has been seen by many for so long time, not as a religion, not as an acceptable religion. And we could give, how many examples of this kind, including, to some extent, I'm come from a Roman Catholic country. I'm Roman Catholic myself. Roman Catholicism in many countries. And we must constantly remind ourselves that religious freedom is not nice. It's just not nice. Religious freedom implies at many social manifestations a high degree of engagement with something which is alien to us, which is disturbing to us, that is religious freedom. So I perfectly understand that we can't push too far on this line. But we have to be aware that when we speak about religious freedom, we don't speak only about religious freedom of those whom we like, or of those whom we find nice, of those whom we can anticipate and predict that their developments and actions will be reassuring. There is a lot of risk to be taken with religious freedom.
Thank you. Professor Mustafa, did you want to comment?
I'll just take forward from Marco. One, that the moment you accept and concede that there has to be a religious freedom, some amount of divergence of opinion on things you have to concede. Two, if you look at freedom of religion provisions across the world, there are limitation clauses, and the limitation clauses would take care of the problem you are raising about violence or aggression, because freedom of religion is subject to public order, health, morality, and other fundamental rights or other human rights. So if your freedom of religion is coming in conflict with my right to life or my right to equality, then the Constitution would have that kind of compromise that you have to make way for my right to equality or my right to life. In any case, I would believe that most religion, if interpreted properly, would not talk of aggression, would not talk of violence, would not talk of anything bad about fellow human beings. In one statement, I made a reference to Islam, and there I said that they make a distinction between rights of God and rights of men, and they say that rights of men are more important. There is a verse in Quran which says, if you kill one human being, it shall be deemed that you have killed the whole humanity. And if you kill save one human being, it shall be deemed that you have saved the whole humanity. Now, what is happening that these religious fanatics are able to present their viewpoint of religion as true religion. Freedom of religion, as I said earlier, will make room for reinterpretation of religious texts and contextualize, as he rightly said. Some of the verses of the Quran which are talked about on some websites promoting violence, these are the verses of the war time when Muslims and the Arabs were at war. They were revealed in a specific context. Today they don't apply. If we need to, 80% of Muslims in the world today live as a minority, and their minority status is permanent. Therefore, it is the Meccan Islam when Prophet was living as a minority, and you need to look at those kind of verses for implementation today. So I would believe, even for jihad, for instance, it is said that the best form of jihad is to fight against oneself, not taking arms and killing innocent people. So freedom of religion will make room for that kind of debate to tell us what is true religion. And we can very well counter people who say that religion is teaching violence or aggression about others.
Very good. Mr. Wilson.
Just quickly, I mean, I sort of, in reference to the comments earlier about how religious freedom isn't always nice. Well, that's true, I mean, but that's not an issue of religious freedom, that's an issue of freedom more generally. Freedom leads to the unpredictable. Freedom gives freedom to everybody, not just for the select few or the people you annoy, and people can use it for the most wonderful things and the most horrific things. I agree with you that the line generally should be about limiting incitement, but that isn't just about religion, that's just about any type of act, and it can be motivated by any cause or any objective. I think once we get below something of incitement and look at social marginalisation or social division or other, what I think everybody would broadly consider to be undesirable exercises of people's freedom, it's very poorly addressed through law. It's much better dealt with through different forms of social structures where people hold each other to account. Adam Smith wrote in his theory of moral sentiments that, people measure their conduct for wanting to be held in the good standing of others. And when we obsess about law, which is very important, we underplay the other social structures in our society which measure our conduct. And that can go all the way from codes of conduct that exist in the workplace about how we think it's appropriate to treat other people, some of which may match law but may not always be perfectly reflective of law, to the values that people accept on the sporting field that promote a culture of tolerance. But in the end, it has to also be to engender a culture where we empower bystanders to stand up and speak out for those people who may be the victims of people abusing or misusing, perhaps is the better phrase, their freedom to preach outcomes that in our society which are not desirable.
Thank you. Another question. Let's see. Okay, yes, sir.
I'm from Cambodia. My question is that my question would be addressed to Professor Mustafa. In recent years, we have seen human world have witnessed the religious monument destruction, especially in Afghanistan and most of Muslim countries. And also in recent time, because we are, as a Cambodian, most of our population are believing in Buddhism. And in recent time, we witnessed the bomb blast in Bodh Gaya. So my question is to Professor Mustafa, what is Indian law to ensure that the remains of Buddhist monument or heritage or ruin in India are secure from this kind of attempt? Thank you.
Everyone has to condemn in the strongest possible terms the kind of vandalism you had about the Buddhist shrines in Afghanistan during Taliban rule. And similar thing is now we are experiencing in Iraq. But about India, we already have a law which protects all religious monuments. And there are very serious penalties for any kind of disfigurement or change of character of the religious monuments. So the character of all the religious buildings as it stood on the day of independence on 15th of August 1947 has been legally protected, except of course about the Babri Mosque, about which there is a litigation going on and we can't do much about it. But otherwise, religious monuments are protected. And if I can give you an example, in 1985 or so, in Delhi, we had only about 550 religious buildings. Today, we have 2,800 religious buildings in one city. So there is a rise in religiosity in the country, and all religious buildings, including Buddhist shrines, are fully protected. Bomb blast can take place anywhere. It has taken place in the Makkah Mosque in Hyderabad. It has taken place at the Ajmer Shrine. It has taken place at Akshardham Temple. So anywhere where you have, a crowd, the terrorists would like to strike. So it was not directed against Buddhists at all. They just wanted to draw the attention. That's how it's attention-seeking tactics by the terrorists. Nothing particular against Buddhism in India.
Thank you. We had a question down here, yes.
My name is Abdurrahman Ahmad. I come from Nigeria. I'm an imam. My question really is, we have talked about freedom, religious freedom, social stability. I like to ask, are there legitimate limits to religious and other freedoms? Who determines the limit of these freedoms? Really, we have been talking about social stability. Is it an imperative? Is social change necessarily bad? This is my question.
Professor Ventura, we'll let you begin with that.
Well, the international instruments provide, along with the definition of religious freedom, a list of legitimate restrictions, grounds for restrictions. And some of the clauses that have been mentioned, public order, morality, health sometimes, can be understood as included in a concept of social stability, but social stability as such is not recognized as a clause for restriction. I believe that when you mention social change, how do you combine desirable social change and social stability? Well, this is probably the heart of the matter here, and already in the keynote yesterday we had very, very fundamental elements for this reflection. I believe that what seems to me, I'm now sort of drawing my conclusion of what I heard so far from some questions from the audience, the keynote yesterday, is that there is a sense that true social stability can only be achieved through a genuine opening to social change. I believe that there is a pretty strong consensus in this sense, that some degree of social change is essential to social stability. Well, we have articulated this in many different ways. There was a strong team, you had a very strong reference to the new social environment, right? You had a very strong argument about religions should take notice and cope with this change. So I believe that this is really the heart of the matter here. Now, of course, I understand that it's just very general, and it's still very hard to define which kind of social change is desirable and which is not. But I like to think that religions are involved in this process of bringing a good social change, which would make for good social stability to benefit the general public.
Thank you. And we'll let each of you, if you have any final comments. Mr. Wilson?
I'll just quickly add to that. I mean, that's 100% right. Social stability cannot be built on an opposition to change. It must be about an accommodation of change. It's a sort of genuine conservative position about the management of change. And the reality is we've come into a time not just around different or varying social and cultural norms, but in practice, we will live in a world of change that's moving faster than ever. And that sounds very trite and stereotypical, but in practice, everybody says it because it's true. And it has multiple manifestations through the use of technology, the connection of people between countries and boundaries, the greater social acceptance of marginalised groups in the past. And this is why I say that in the past, religion has enjoyed a certain position. I think it is now sitting much more equally with other sorts of value sets that exist within our society and identity groups that exist within our society. So to have a process that values religious freedom requires religious freedom always being, or those who represent the case for religious freedom being at the table. But social stability is not an end in of itself. Too much social stability creates an environment where people are suffocated from their individuality. And that's why it remains a constant contest, but that contest, if you want yourself represented, has to have everybody at the table.
Professor Mustafa.
I would just respond in one sentence that religious groups have come together to show their allegiance to the social contract called the Constitution of India, and therefore we have given this power to the Constitution to limit. They will set the rules of the game. So what kind of religious freedom and how much each one of us would have, Constitution will decide. And Constitution will keep in mind the social harmony and good relations, social stability in mind as the fundamental value of any social system.
Well, I think you can appreciate the wonderful dialogue we've already had this morning. Please join with me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their comments. Now we have let's just look at the schedule. We have a short break at 10:45. Please be back in your seats, and we'll begin with our next session. There'll be breakout sessions, and you'll note in the program the different locations. Some of those locations have only certain languages that are going to be available. Those will be indicated outside the door. So we'd encourage you to look at the program carefully and determine where you want to go to be in your seats at 10:45. Thank you.